Anaritzia Karl Hoffmann's hand shook as he brought the spoon to his lips. Fresh milk, real milk, he hadn't tasted it in 2 years. Not the chalky stuff the Afrika Korps had been stuck with since 41, but the cold, rich kind he remembered from before the war. The Wehrmacht always said the Americans were running on fumes, but this milk said otherwise. Later, he'd scribble the truth in his hidden journal, the kind of thing that would have landed him in serious trouble back in his barracks. The Americans feed their prisoners better than Germany feeds its own troops. June 4th, 1943, Mexia, Texas. The air in the new camp, 4 miles out of town, smelled like coffee and fried bacon. Through the mess hall windows, Hoffmann watched American guards lounging and biting into sandwiches, meat piled thick in the desert. His unit survived on a handful of canned meat and a chunk of bread each day, sometimes spiced up with whatever they could seize from the British. It wasn't much, but here, in a country Nazi propaganda painted as weak and corrupted, food seemed endless. That morning, 1,850 veterans of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps filed into the mess hall. This wasn't some battered field kitchen with a horse-drawn wagon doling out watery stew. The mess had electric fridges, steam tables, real dishes, even silverware. Each set of 5 barracks had its own hall with cooks and waiters, serving up hot meals. The whole town of Mexia turned out to gawk at the parade of tanned enemy soldiers marching along Railroad Street. No one realized that breakfast was about to upend everything these men thought they knew. All it took was a tray loaded with eggs, bacon, buttered white bread, jam, and real coffee. The numbers behind American farming weren't just empty statistics. They were stacked right on those metal trays. Nazi racial theory didn't crack under the weight of tanks or bombs, but under the impossible reality of breakfast. It all started back in Tunisia. May 13, 1943, Rommel was gone, replaced, and the new general surrendered just like that. 275,000 German and Italian soldiers laid down their arms. The Afrika Korps, who'd pushed the British to the edge of Cairo, suddenly found themselves prisoners. Among them was Obergefreiter Franz Müller, Iron Cross Second Class, who'd marched across Poland and France and outlasted the desert. Decades later, historians would pore over his notes, hunting for details about the food shock in America's POW camps. We'd been living on 750 grams of bread, 150 grams of fat, and 120 grams of sausage or tinned fish, if we were lucky, he wrote. More often, it was dates, the enemy's rations, or nothing at all. The shock started in the holding cages at Tunis. Müller and 30,000 others waited for ships in makeshift camps, and even there, the Americans started breaking down their old beliefs. The U.S. Army ran things with a kind of efficiency the Wehrmacht could only envy even in its prime, but food delivered the real gut punch. Feldwebel Hans Klein, who got captured with the 15th Panzer Division, rode home from Camp McCain in Mississippi 6 months later. In the cages at Tunis, as we waited for ships, the Americans gave us white bread. White bread. In Africa, we got necrot, a rock-hard wheat cracker when we were lucky. The guards ate more bread at one meal than my whole squad saw in a week. Getting to America was another surprise. The Liberty ships, 3 a day, rolling off the lines, hauled supplies to Europe, then carried prisoners back. Instead of the cattle cars they expected, the Germans rode in ship holds refitted for people, lights, fresh air, real toilets. 30,000 men a month crossed the Atlantic this way. The voyage itself was another jolt. Gerhard Wilhelm Becker from the 21st Panzer Division kept a food diary, sending details home after he returned. Breakfast, oatmeal with sugar and milk, white bread with butter, coffee with cream. He wrote on July 15th, "This was officers' food in Germany, not for common soldiers. Even we prisoners got it. The food on those American ships blew the Germans away. They saw merchant sailors eating steak and eggs, fresh vegetables, even ice cream. Ice cream! Back in Germany, only top party officials ever saw that. The leftovers alone, what the sailors tossed overboard, had more calories than entire German army units got in a whole day. Lieutenant Heinrich Weber, who came from a long line of Prussian soldiers, remembered watching those meals get dumped as they neared the American coast. Whole plates, barely touched, straight into the sea. He thought about his men in Africa, grateful for a handful of dates and some foul-tasting water. That's when it hit him. They weren't just fighting an enemy. They were up against a whole civilization they couldn't even begin to understand. August 2nd, 1943, Norfolk Naval Base, Virginia. The first meal on American soil shattered whatever Nazi propaganda still lingered about American weakness. The Germans didn't know what to make of the Pullman train cars, the country's sheer size, or the obvious prosperity that showed no scars from war. But the food, they never expected that. At the processing station, they got a meal that was almost surreal. Fried chicken, mashed potatoes swimming in gravy, green beans, cornbread, apple pie, and real coffee with real sugar. Johann Fischer, a baker's son from Munich, did the math in his diary. That one meal had more meat than his family back home got all month. The Americans even apologized for the simple meal. They hadn't expected the prisoners to arrive that day. Fischer just wrote, "They apologized for food German generals would have called a feast." That's when I realized how wrong we'd been. The train ride from Norfolk to the prison camps in Texas and Oklahoma broke Nazi ideology faster than any battle ever could. As the trains rolled through Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas, the prisoners pressed their faces to the glass. They saw an America that Nazi doctrine swore couldn't exist. At every stop, railroad workers ate meat sandwiches, guzzled Coca-Cola, and smoked cigarettes without a single thought about rationing. In Memphis, prisoners watched workers load up a dining car with fresh beef, eggs, potatoes, boxes of vegetables. The amount, just for one train, was more than whole German divisions ever saw in Africa. Rudolf Richter, who used to inspect farms in Westphalia, wrote it all down. He saw freight cars stacked with wheat, refrigerated ones full of meat and milk, entire trains just for moving food from farms to cities. No guards, no special security. Food just moved, steady as a river. September 19th, 1943, Camp Hearne, Texas. The permanent camps took things even further. The U.S. wanted to make life as good as possible for prisoners for two reasons: to make sure American POWs got decent treatment in return, and to win over the Germans who'd go home to rebuild Europe after the war. The mess halls there outdid anything most of these guys had ever seen, even before the war. Electric fridges ran day and night, dishwashers scrubbed thousands of plates, steam tables kept food warm for hours, giant mixers worked dough for fresh bread every day. The Geneva Convention said prisoners had to get the same food, clothes, and medical care as American soldiers. At Camp Swift, Carl Hoffman got assigned to kitchen duty. What he saw there stuck with him for decades. "Today we threw out 300 pounds of food," he wrote. "Not spoiled, just extra. The rules say make 10% more than needed, just in case. The rest gets tossed." The ration chart sounded like something out of a dream. 3/4 of a pound of meat every day, a pound of potatoes, half a pound of vegetables, 3/4 of a pound of bread, plus sugar, coffee, milk, butter, and eggs. Feeding prisoners cost a lot, so the government made sure farmers who used prisoner labor paid 45 cents an hour to help cover the expense. At Camp McCain in Mississippi, Hans Klein wrote home, For breakfast, we get oatmeal or cornflakes with milk and sugar, scrambled eggs, bacon, toast with butter and jam, coffee with cream. Lunch is always meat, plus vegetables, potatoes, or rice, bread and dessert. Dinner, more meat, more vegetables, soup, bread, and coffee. Sundays always meant chicken or turkey with all the trimmings. The prisoners couldn't believe it. American military rations were way better than what most Germans had gotten, even before the war started. Back in 1942 and 43, German civilians were down to 2,780 calories a day, and then it dropped to just under 2,000. Meanwhile, German POWs in American camps were eating over 3,000 calories every day. At Camp Clinton in Mississippi, where they kept the highest-ranking German officers, 25 generals even, things got even more surreal. General von Arnim, who replaced Rommel, had his own house, a car, and a driver. The generals had private cooks and could request nearly anything. They ate steaks, roasted chicken, fresh fish, and vegetables, foods regular Germans hadn't seen since 1940, but honestly, even the rations for regular soldiers blew them away. Oberfeldwebel Franz Müller wrote home from Camp Shelby, "Today for lunch we had fried catfish, fresh from the Mississippi rivers, with coleslaw, hush puppies, fried cornbread, green beans, and peach cobbler for dessert. The black soldiers who serve us eat the same food. In Germany, we'd been told Americans starved their black population. Another lie exposed. By the fall of 1943, German POWs were working on American farms, and that really shattered whatever beliefs they still had about Nazi agricultural superiority. From when prisoners started arriving in 1943 until the end of the war, they picked peaches and citrus in Texas, harvested rice, cut wood, baled hay, threshed grain, and gathered pecans. At a dairy farm outside Huntsville, Texas, Unterarzt Ernst Wagner watched in disbelief as a farmer dumped hundreds of gallons of milk on the ground just because the plant couldn't handle all of it. Wagner wrote, "Milk German mothers would have begged for, just used to irrigate pastures. When Wagner complained, the farmer just shrugged. It was overproduction, and if all that milk hit the market, prices would crash." About 12,000 POWs ended up in Nebraska camps. They worked across from farms, stacking hay, working in the sugar beet fields, or helping with corn. Gerrit Paul Schmidt worked on a corn farm. He wrote, "The farmers' chickens eat as much grain as they want. The cats get fresh milk every day. The dogs get meat scraps, enough to feed a German family for days." American farmers who hired POW labor often invited them into their homes for meals. As long as a guard was there, it broke no rules. These meals in farm kitchens really shook the prisoners. The farmers who contracted for POW labor usually fed them, and the spreads were huge. Platters of fried chicken, bowls of mashed potatoes, swimming in butter, green beans cooked with ham, corn on the cob dripping with butter, biscuits and gravy, all kinds of pie, pitchers of cold milk, endless coffee. Christmas 1943 hit especially hard. The holiday meal at Camp Hearne, Texas, felt like something out of a dream. Roast turkey with stuffing, honey-glazed ham, mashed potatoes with giblet gravy, candied sweet potatoes, green beans, corn, cranberry sauce, fresh baked rolls with butter, mince pie, pumpkin pie, apple pie with ice cream, coffee, milk, and apple cider. Feldwebel Hans Klein wrote from Camp McCain, "We ate until we were sick, not from bad food, but just the sheer amount. Our stomachs, after years of not enough, just couldn't keep up." Men wept while they ate, thinking of hungry families back home. The contrast with German rations was brutal. POWs back in Germany were living on potatoes, 9 pounds a week plus 5 pounds of bread, 2.5 pounds of cabbage, a little margarine, and ersatz coffee made from acorns. Meanwhile, POWs in America ate better than they had since before the war. By spring 1944, things got even more astonishing. Fresh vegetables, lettuce, tomatoes, cucumbers, radishes, carrots, celery, showed up daily. Fruits they hadn't seen in years, oranges, grapefruit, bananas, strawberries when they were in season. The variety alone was overwhelming for men used to gray, monotonous military meals. Camp bakeries turned out fresh bread every day, white, wheat, rye, whatever the bakers felt like making. Prisoners working in the bakery were stunned they'd use more flour in a day than a German bakery got in a month. Unterarzt Johann Fischer, a baker's son, worked at the Camp Swift bakery. "We bake 500 loaves every day for our compound alone," he wrote. "Pastries, cakes, cookies for special occasions. The sugar we use for one day's desserts would keep a German bakery going for months." By summer 1944, the shock hadn't worn off. When news of the Normandy invasion broke on June 6th, it was clear Germany was now fighting on three fronts. Still, nothing really changed in the POW camps in America, not in terms of food anyway. If anything, things got a bit better. More prisoners got assigned to work on farms, and for the first time, they saw up close where all that American abundance actually came from. Out in Nebraska, some of the guys found themselves in sugar beet fields, amazed that one county could produce more beets than several German provinces put together. In Arkansas, at a canning factory, prisoners watched tons of perfectly good peaches get tossed out just for having a bruise or two. Over at Fort Lewis in Washington, another group of German POWs had their own awakening. One of them, an 18-year-old named G.A. Gra, had just arrived that August after being captured in Normandy. He stood in front of the camp canteen debating should he buy ice cream or a Coke. He'd never even tasted Coca-Cola before. In his own words, "The last ice cream I'd been able to buy in Germany was years ago, but Coca-Cola never before, so I decided to take both. I suddenly realized how extremely lucky I had been to be captured by the American army and not the Russian one." By September 1944, after a year or more in captivity, a lot of German POWs had put on 20 or 30 pounds. Medical checkups showed they were healthier than ever, better teeth from all the milk, stronger bones from protein, clearer skin from actual fruits and vegetables. Dr. Friedrich Bauer, a German medical officer locked up at Camp Shelby in Mississippi, kept track of these changes. The men who'd come in sick and malnourished, scurvy, pellagra, all sorts of deficiencies, looked nothing like the men they'd been. After a year on American rations, they were in the best shape of their lives. But the changes weren't just physical. The psychological shift ran even deeper. Gerrit Wilhelm Becker wrote, "We no longer speak of German victory. How can we defeat a nation that feeds prisoners abundantly while fighting on so many fronts? This level of resources is just unbeatable." December 1944 brought the Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last big push. But in the POW camps, Christmas dinner that year topped even the previous one. Turkey, ham, roast beef, the whole spread. Special treats too, fruit cakes shipped in from American bakeries, candy canes, real chocolate, not that ersatz stuff made from turnips back home, nuts, fresh fruit. At Camp Clinton, Mississippi, Italian POWs who'd switched sides got to help make pasta for Christmas, using olive oil, real cheese, white flour, ingredients that had vanished from German kitchens years earlier. The Germans watched their old allies cook up food they hadn't seen in ages. May 8th, 1945, Victory in Europe Day. The war was finally over, but the food revelations just kept coming. German POWs learned that all through the war, American civilians never truly faced food shortages. Sure, meat was rationed, sugar and coffee were tighter, but real hunger? It never happened. American farms were so productive, War barely touched them. That May, the Provost Marshal General's office actually cut back the food and ended canteen sales because civilians started complaining that the prisoners were eating too well. Even with smaller rations, German POWs in America still got more to eat than civilians back in Germany, and that would stay true for years. The numbers tell the story. On average, German POWs in the US got 3,200 calories a day. German soldiers at the front were supposed to get 3,600 calories, but that only happened when supplies made it through, which was rare. Civilians in Germany by 1945 scraped by on less than 1,412 calories a day. In American camps, each prisoner got about 3/4 of a pound of meat daily. The German army's weekly ration, when they had it, included just 120 grams of sausage or canned fish. The difference between American plenty and German scarcity became the most convincing argument against Nazi ideology, not through speeches, but through daily life. By summer 1945, as the war wound down and German POWs lined up for repatriation, many begged to stay in America. They'd seen a system that completely rewrote what they thought was possible. Hans Wacker, a POW at Fort Robinson, Nebraska, later put it simply, life in the camps was a vast improvement for many of us who had grown up in cold water flats in Germany. We discovered running water, central heating, and abundant food. Our treatment was excellent. The re-education program achieved its greatest success through meals rather than lectures. Each day, German prisoners confronted evidence that contradicted Nazi teachings about American weakness. Every full stomach chipped away at their old ideas about racial superiority and democracy's supposed failures. After the war, Dr. Walter Schreiber, a former Wehrmacht colonel and agricultural economist, did the math. The food America gave German prisoners could have kept the entire Sixth Army alive at Stalingrad, he said. Their surplus could have fed all of occupied Europe. We just never realized we were fighting a country that had already solved the basic problem of human life, how to feed everyone. Between 1945 and 1946, 371,683 German POWs left American camps and went home. What they found was a Germany in ruins, split apart and starving. But they brought something precious back with them, proof that real prosperity was possible, that a country really could feed all its people, and that democracy, instead of chaos, might actually mean more food on everyone's table. Some of these men even became leaders in West Germany's agricultural transformation. Hans Müller, who'd been locked up at Camp Shelby, brought American farming techniques back to Bavaria and boosted harvests by 40% in 5 years. Wilhelm Fischer from Camp McCain set up food distribution networks modeled on what he'd seen in the States. Friedrich Bauer fought for better nutrition standards, ideas he picked up while behind barbed wire in America. After the war, about 5,000 Germans immigrated to the US, and plenty more would have come if they'd been allowed. For many, it wasn't just about earning a living. It was about the food security they'd tasted as prisoners. October 1947, Fort Lewis, Washington. Gar Gray was among the last German POWs to go home after 3 years in captivity. Decades later, as a successful businessman, he came back to America, but he never forgot that camp canteen moment when he could actually choose between ice cream and Coca-Cola, things his family in Germany could only dream about. We were always treated fairly, he wrote 73 years later. We got enough food and 80 cents a day so we could buy cigarettes, chocolate, ice cream, Coca-Cola, things my mother and sister in Germany could only dream of. 1985, Austin, Texas. At the 40th reunion of German POWs, over 500 former prisoners returned to America, many bringing their families to show them where everything changed. Carl Hoffman, once a Unice, now 78 and an American citizen since 1955, spoke for them all. We came here as warriors of the Third Reich. Sure, we were superior. Sure, American democracy was weak. We left witnesses to a deeper truth. America's strength was in its farm fields, not its race. Every meal in those camps challenged everything we believed. The Americans fed us their enemies better than Hitler fed us his soldiers. They had so much extra that throwing food away was normal. It wasn't an insult, it was just how things were. We learned that a country that can feed its enemies without breaking a sweat has already won. That's what real power looks like. We went home knowing our whole worldview was built on lies. The Americans beat us because they could produce more, not because they were crueler or stronger. We, who once marched as conquerors, got changed by seeing abundance we couldn't have imagined. To America from your former enemies, thank you for showing us that real strength means creating, not destroying. You fed us when we would have starved you. That's the kind of victory that matters. The applause just kept going. Americans and Germans together, old enemies now united, all recognizing how much could change with something as simple as a meal. The story of the German POWs and American food proves that real change comes from experience, not arguments. These soldiers became living proof of democracy's success, not because of political lectures, but because of what they lived through day after day at the dinner table. No propaganda could have shaken Nazi beliefs the way those steady meals did. The transformation was so deep that when Gargray returned to Fort Lewis in 2017 at age 91, he rode his bike across the base with a sign, USA, the country and its people. You are my first and final love. He remembered it was August 1944 when I first came here as a prisoner of war. We were always treated fairly, got enough food and 80 cents a day. That let us buy cigarettes, chocolate, ice cream, and Coca-Cola, things my mother and sister in Germany only dreamed of. That's why I'm here 73 years later to say, thank you, America. I'll never forget. Colonel William Purcell, Deputy Garrison Commander at Joint Base Lewis McChord, welcomed him back with open arms. You show us plain and simple that how we treat others says everything about who we are. It's easy to lose sight of that even now, but you keep reminding us, don't forget this lesson. The German POWs came face to face with American farming power, and it changed them. They showed up as enemies. By the time they left, they were witnesses, and a lot of them came back as immigrants or friends. Their kids would grow up in a democratic Germany, allied with the US, an alliance built on real understanding born from unexpected kindness. The camps themselves, they mostly vanished. After the war, people tore them down or sold off the buildings. The land went back to farming or something else, but the real impact stayed alive in the people who lived through it and in the way Germany rebuilt itself as a democracy. The Marshall Plan, which ended up feeding and rebuilding Europe, grew out of lessons learned in those POW camps. Generosity in victory builds real, lasting peace. Former prisoners who went on to succeed in Germany often pointed back to their time in American camps as the turning point. They saw prosperity coming from cooperation, not conquest. They watched people of different races work together and saw democracy producing order and wealth, not chaos. These weren't just theories. They felt them every day. Dr. Arnold Kramer, the main historian on German POWs in America, nailed it. America won the propaganda war not through clever messages, but through sheer reality. Every meal, every electric light, every working toilet was an argument against Nazism. The POWs were converted by prosperity they could see, touch, and taste. The numbers tell only part of it. Sure, 371,683 German POWs held in America, 14 million man-days of farm work. Fewer than 1% tried to escape. But the heart of the story is about how people changed, how eating well and being treated decently turned enemies into something else. When historians look at why German democracy worked after the war, they talk about the Marshall Plan, denazification, or the Soviet threat. But they sometimes forget about the 370,000 German soldiers who came home after living American democracy every day, being treated fairly, sharing resources, eating well even as prisoners. These men became quiet ambassadors for democracy, spreading what they'd seen to family, friends, and neighbors. They'd lived inside the so-called enemy system and found it better, hands down. That sort of experience shattered Nazi ideology more effectively than any leaflet or speech. When the last German POW left America in 1946, the record they left behind was stunning. The lowest escape rate of any major POW group in history, the highest rate of cooperation, and the most successful transformation of enemy soldiers into future allies. All of it accomplished not by cruelty or brainwashing, but by simple decency and giving people enough to eat. America invested a lot to feed its prisoners, farmers, railroads, trucks, cooks, and got back something you can't measure. Hundreds of thousands of Germans who experienced democracy up close, who saw that American strength came from productivity and not racism, who realized Nazi propaganda was a lie. In the end, the German POW experience in America showed real power isn't about fear or control. It's about creating and sharing abundance. The fact that America could feed its enemies better than Germany could feed its own troops laid bare everything you needed to know about those two systems. No amount of propaganda could cover that up. The POWs arrived expecting to find weakness and division. Instead, they saw endless fields, bustling factories, and, maybe most surprising, genuine humanity. They came as prisoners, but they left as witnesses to what democracy could achieve. Their transformation planted the seeds for the Atlantic Alliance, the Marshall Plan, and a rebuilt democratic Germany. They tasted American plenty and never forgot it. Their grandchildren grew up in a prosperous democratic Germany, allied with the US, part of NATO, citizens of the European Union. You can trace a lot of that back to a single moment when hungry Afrika Korps soldiers sat down to their first American meal and realized everything they'd been told was a lie. Food tipped the scales of the war just as much as any weapon. Good food can win people over just as much as any battle, maybe even more. That's how you build real peace, not by scaring people, but by showing them a future everyone can share. The German prisoners were honestly shocked at how much better American prison meals were compared to their own army rations. That shock did something to them. It started to change how they saw things. Suddenly, there was this tiny spark of hope. Maybe old enemies could actually become friends. Maybe democracy didn't have to come from the barrel of a gun, but from something as simple and as powerful as sitting down to a decent meal, even with the folks you once fought against.